When I was an 18-year-old flight instructor, I had a very good student who owned a beautiful Piper Cherokee 235. Let's call him Chuck. Chuck was twice my age, what I thought was middle-aged at the time, probably, 35 or so. Now, to a young flight instructor flying that big engine Cherokee 235 with a deep voice and the constant speed propeller was about as good as it got. For me, it was nearly the equivalent of flying a heavy jet. After flying with Chuck for a couple of months, he took me aside after one of our lessons and said, "Michael, I'd like to get my wife Alice into the left seat so she can enjoy the flying with me, and we can go places together in our beautiful airplane. Would you mind flying with her and getting her up to speed in our Cherokee?" Did I mention that for me, flying that Cherokee 235 at the time was akin to flying a really big, complex airplane? "Of course," I answered enthusiastically, "of course. I'd be happy to fly with Alice," mentally calculating all of that Cherokee 235 heavy time I was going to add to my meager logbook. Alice and I flew together for about 7 lessons. I dutifully taught her all I knew about the basics of flying: how to taxi, fly straight and level, perform glides and climbs and medium and shallow turns, stalls and slow flight, of course, how to talk on the radio, and how to bring the Cherokee safely back to Earth. All things that a primary student would need to get started as a pilot. But after the 7th lesson, I began to wonder why Alice wasn't improving, in spite of my excellent instruction. She just didn't seem to be getting it. Worse, she didn't seem to be enjoying the flying at all. So after that flight, we went to the conference room for a debrief. I looked across the table at her, and though I didn't understand the gravity of my question at the time, I asked, "Alice, why do you want to learn to fly?" After a short pause, she burst into tears. "Oh, shit," I said to myself. I might have even said it in my outside voice. Did I mention that she and her husband were grown-ups, adults, twice my age? First thought, I've done something to upset this man's wife, and he is going to kill me. Her sobbing turned into a soft wail. So, not knowing what else to do, I panicked and rushed out of the room to retrieve her husband, reassuring him on the way back in that I had done nothing to warrant Alice's emotional upset. I hoped he'd quickly right whatever emotion she was having, and we could continue the debrief. When Chuck came into the room, he sat next to Alice, wrapped his arm around her shoulder, offered her a Kleenex, and consoled her. The sobbing and wailing stopped, but her big brown eyes remained flooded with tears. Slowly, Alice admitted to us both that she never really wanted to learn to fly at all. It was Chuck's idea. And without any motivation to learn, she was a very poor student. What a huge lesson for a young, freshly minted, all-knowing flight instructor. I had failed to address TMIT, as I call it now, the most important thing in Alice's world. I missed the fact she hadn't chosen to be a student. I was so confident in my skills as a pilot and flight instructor, like most of us. It blinded me to understanding her process, her why. She even admitted to us that she was scared of flying. That possibility hadn't even occurred to me. What I learned from that terrifying experience was that there's a whole other world that I had learned nothing about in my FAA-required training as a flight instructor. An internal world, a very human world. The secret ingredient to teaching pilots or being an extraordinary pilot is to engage fully with that human. I wasn't meeting Alice where she was, didn't consider her emotions, her fears, her feelings, her lack of motivation for being there. And without any understanding of those key ingredients, she wasn't going to learn, no matter how much I unleashed my most excellent flight instruction mojo on her. Man, I had a lot to learn about learning, which should always be based on the why before I could begin to teach. I also had a lot to learn about emotional intelligence and self-awareness, which I failed at miserably here. As with most 18-year-old pilot instructors, I was sure I was the center of the universe, just ask me. But I had so much to learn about myself and my students' process if I was to help them find their unique path to their goals. I needed to be present, and I was so wrapped up in my role as flight instructor that I wasn't listening and wasn't looking for cues and clues about Alice's internal process. What's our personal why for learning to fly, or to continue learning how to fly well? Well, many of my students over the years came to me ostensibly to learn something about flying airplanes or helicopters. But what soon emerges on a deeper, less obvious level, if we're looking for it, is they were really there to learn or prove something about themselves. That is a much bigger challenge than simply learning to wiggle the sticks correctly. That elephant in the room, if you will, the bigger why, should never be ignored. There's a why to everything we do, yet most of us don't pause to ask that question. Why do we learn how to do chandelles or turns about a point, power off landings, or low instrument missed approaches? What's the why of those maneuvers? Here's a pro tip. It's not just about wowing an examiner and passing the check ride. There are human skills to learn which are not just another worthless FA mnemonic to memorize to pass the check ride. And developing these skills goes well beyond practicing more touch and goes, which unfortunately is where too many pilots tend to put their emphasis and stop. Rather, the higher level of learning is about human skills like discernment, discipline, engagement, that emotional intelligence we mentioned, learning how our unique brains work, how we learn. Some call these critical things soft skills, though I think that term only serves to belittle them, to make them less important, or to keep things we fear or don't understand separate, at arm's length, safely away from our carefully curated image of ourselves. I prefer to think of these skills as crucial human skills, the very foundation required to become extraordinary pilots, extraordinary humans, maybe even to be extraordinary at whatever we do. So let's launch this first episode of Extraordinary Pilots with a new awareness of the importance of the why. The why grounds us in the true higher reasons we do things and opens the door to higher levels of learning, real human learning. Alice's lesson that day, decades ago, opened the door to a vast alternative universe of human awareness for me. I had no idea it even existed. That discovery has informed all of my work as a teacher since. What a gift she offered me, even if I didn't get it at the time. It's taken me years to say this, and she might already be gone, but thank you for that lesson, Alice. Thank you. So what's the big takeaway from this first episode of Extraordinary Pilots? Well, it's simply this. When we don't know the why, whether we're teaching or learning something ourselves, we're wasting our time with the how. Let me say that again. When we don't know the why, we're wasting our time with the how. What's your why?